What if everything you thought you knew about modern naval power was already incomplete? What if today's most decisive battles are no longer fought with missiles alone, but with logistic surveillance and economic pressure? Because something unusual has been unfolding at sea, not as a single dramatic event, but as a repeating pattern, quiet, consistent, and increasingly difficult to ignore. Two oil tankers, linked to Iranian export routes, were recently reported attempting to move through heavily monitored waters, and both were stopped in what appears to be a rapid and highly coordinated enforcement sequence. No prolonged engagement, no visible escalation, just interception, inspection, and immediate control of movement. Now the real question begins here. Was this routine maritime enforcement, or a sign of a deeper structural shift in how power is applied at sea? Because when we step back, a broader pattern starts to emerge. Over recent weeks, maritime traffic in and around key energy corridors has begun to behave differently. Some vessels adjust routes earlier than before, some delay departure windows, and some appear to avoid certain zones entirely, not because of a single confrontation, but because of perceived risk accumulation. And perception in modern naval strategy can influence behavior as strongly as physical force. To understand this, we need to zoom out. Modern maritime control is no longer just about blocking passage. It is about shaping decisions before ships even move, through surveillance networks, through insurance pressure, and through the uncertainty of enforcement timing. In that environment, a tanker is not just a vessel. It becomes a financial instrument, exposed to geopolitical volatility. Every delay affects insurance premiums. Every rerouting changes delivery pricing, and every inspection reshapes commercial confidence. Now this is where the system becomes more complex, because multiple layers are operating at the same time. Energy infrastructure, military presence, and geopolitical signaling, all interacting within the same space, none of them fully visible on their own, but collectively shaping behavior across the entire region. Reports from maritime tracking sources suggest that enforcement activity around Iranian-linked shipping routes has increased in frequency compared to earlier periods. But what matters more than frequency is consistency, because consistency changes expectations. And when expectations change, markets begin to adapt before policy does. Energy traders begin adjusting risk models. Shipping firms shorten exposure windows, and insurers reassess coverage thresholds, not because of confirmed escalation, but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty is often the most powerful force in global logistics. Now let's look at the strategic layer. Some analysts suggest that these enforcement patterns may be part of a broader pressure framework, not designed for immediate disruption, but for gradual constraint, targeting specific flows, rather than entire shipping lanes. This distinction is important, because it allows global trade to continue, while still applying pressure on selected economic channels. That makes the system harder to challenge politically, while still impactful economically. And that balance is what defines modern hybrid maritime strategy. Now let's bring in the operational environment. Multiple reports indicate that the region is currently supported by a dense surveillance architecture, including naval strike groups, maritime patrol aircraft, and satellite-based tracking systems. Each layer contributes a different form of awareness: surface monitoring, subsurface detection, and long-range signal intelligence. Together they form a continuous observation grid over key maritime corridors. Within such a system, movement becomes visible earlier, and risk increases with proximity. This does not guarantee interception in every case, but it increases the cost of uncertainty, and that cost is often enough to change behavior. Now we move into the economic dimension. Iran's economy remains heavily dependent on energy exports, and even partial disruption of export flow creates ripple effects across fiscal planning. Revenue contraction impacts state budgets, military funding structures, and regional financial networks, including proxy funding channels that rely on steady liquidity. When that liquidity slows, the effects are not immediate collapse, but gradual tightening, reduced flexibility, delayed payments, and increasing internal pressure. Some economic estimates suggest that a significant reduction in export capacity could translate into tens of millions of dollars in lost daily revenue, and over time, that compounds into structural financial strain. But the key point here is not the exact number. It is the direction of pressure, because sustained constraints create strategic urgency, and urgency changes decision-making speed. Now there's another layer rarely discussed: the physical limitation of storage and transport capacity. Oil infrastructure is not infinitely flexible. Storage tanks fill. Pipelines operate within limits. and production cannot pause indefinitely without damage. When export channels slow, internal pressure begins to build, and producers face difficult choices: continue production or reduce output to avoid overflow and system stress. Neither option is strategically ideal, and both carry long-term consequences. This is where maritime access becomes critical, because without movement, the entire upstream system begins to compress. Now we shift to behavior. One of the most important indicators in any pressure system is not what is happening physically, but how actors respond behaviorally. In this case, some shipping operators appear to be adopting more conservative routing strategies, avoiding certain maritime corridors, or reducing exposure time near high-risk zones. This does not necessarily indicate fear of direct confrontation, but adaptation to perceived enforcement probability. And that distinction matters, because perception-driven behavior can stabilize or escalate situations without a single new incident occurring. Now here is the deeper strategic question. Is this system designed to enforce control, or to shape negotiation conditions over time? Because historically, maritime pressure systems rarely exist in isolation. They interact with diplomacy, energy markets, and domestic political stability, and those interactions determine long-term outcomes. Now let's step back again. What we are observing is not a single conflict event. It is a layered system, where maritime enforcement, economic pressure, and strategic signaling, each reinforcing the other in subtle ways. Now we return to the core tension. If export routes remain constrained, economic pressure continues to accumulate. If enforcement weakens, flows may partially recover, but neither outcome is simple, because every adjustment triggers reaction elsewhere in the system. This is what makes modern maritime geopolitics fundamentally different. It is not linear. It is dynamic, and constantly adjusting. Now the question becomes forward-looking. If current patterns continue, how will global energy logistics adapt? Will supply chains reroute permanently? Or will new corridors emerge under different risk structures? And more importantly, how long can any system operate under sustained uncertainty before it seeks a new equilibrium? Because systems always move toward balance, even if that balance is unstable. And right now, no one can clearly define what that next balance will look like. What is clear is that maritime control is no longer just about access. It is about timing, predictability, and psychological pressure. And those elements are becoming just as important as physical dominance. Now we reach the final layer. The future of this situation does not depend on a single event. It depends on accumulated pressure across multiple domains: economic, strategic, and operational, each reinforcing the other, each increasing system tension over time. And at some point, these pressures demand resolution. But how that resolution appears remains uncertain, because in modern geopolitics, resolution does not always come through agreement. Sometimes it comes through adaptation, sometimes through recalibration, and sometimes through escalation into a new structure entirely. And that is why this moment matters. Not because of a single tanker or a single interception, but because of what it suggests about the evolving nature of maritime power. The ocean has always been a space of movement, but it is increasingly becoming a space of control. And control is now measured not only in ships intercepted, but in decisions never made at all. So the real question is not what happened at sea. It is what changes quietly because of it, and what the next decision will look like when pressure builds one step further. Because in systems like this, nothing stays static for long, and the next shift may already be underway.